All right, I love getting myself in trouble sometimes. Not really, this is in my own head, because this week in our reading, you notice there's still a little bit of Psalms left, but I feel like I covered the Psalms how I wanted to cover the Psalms. And if you have been tracking in our New Testament, we have just entered a very interesting book in the New Testament, which is the letter to the Romans. The letter to the Romans. And I say get myself into trouble because there's just so much in the book of Romans. It is Paul's longest letter that he wrote. It has his most sustained argument on a particular issues. And there is no doubt in the last 2,000 years that more ink has been spilled writing on and commentating and interpreting the book of Romans. There's one historical theologian, which I think it's pretty accurate what he says. He said once that you can basically write the history of Christian theology by simply surveying all the different ways that Romans has been interpreted through the years. It's just been the book to go to. Many people treat it as like a systematic theology, as though like you can go to it and you can formulate like just basically what Christian theology is by the book of Romans. But I would say in recent times there has been a tendency with a lot of things, right? It's good to simplify things, right? You like things that are easy and you're able to understand it and grasp it. But then also that sometimes it goes a little too far and things get simplistic or maybe too oversimplified, way too reduced down to simple formulas. And this has happened in Romans quite often. How many of you have heard of the famous Romans Road? Right? I mean, most have heard of the Romans Road. Has anybody in here, I don't know, when I was real young, I went to these things. Have you ever been to like different like evangelism trainings? Like, all right, let's get excited about evangelism and let's learn how to do it. And it's very possible that if you went to one today, you could get met with the Romans Road right from the get-go. And what that is basically, so you have the Apostle Paul's longest letter. And what we're basically going to do is we're going to pick out from this letter about like 7 sentences, and we're going to show basically, we're going to answer the question, how does someone get saved? We're going to bring that question to the text. How do you get saved? And you go to Romans and you find a few things and you put it together and you say, this is the master plan. Sometimes oversimplified, too simplistic. And it usually will go something like this for those that are like, what is the Romans Road? You'll take a verse like out of chapter 3. All have sinned and fall short of the glory. And then you'll move, right? And for those that sin, the wages of sin is death. But, right, then you got the holy buts are the best in the Bible. What? One T, come on, the holy buts. But the gift of God is eternal life in Jesus Christ. And God demonstrated that love towards us. And if you confess, and what you don't know right now, we're like in Romans 3, then we're in Romans 6, then we're going back to Romans 5, then we're going to jump all the way to Romans 10. And we're just going to take these like little one sentences and go from 3 to 6 to 5 to 10. But if you confess, you'll be saved. And then we'll jump all the way back to 3. And through faith, you'll be justified. Then we'll jump to 8. And one of the greatest chapters maybe in Romans where it talks about there's no condemnation and nothing can separate you from his love. And we'll close the book. And we've answered the question, how do you get saved? And now we've done it. And I'm not making any of that wrong necessarily. It's not like it's wrong, and it's not like it hasn't been effective, and it's not like it hasn't got to the gist of beginning to share with somebody, some basic truths. But a lot of times that's how people kind of understand the book of Romans. Like almost like that's what the book of Romans was kind of like meant to do. Paul was trying to answer people's questions. Very simple, like here's how you get saved. And we don't know why he wrote 16 chapters. He should have just wrote about 10 sentences. But as we dive into Romans, and maybe today, I hope I don't get too dry here, because anytime you start with the book of Romans, I mean, it just requires a little bit of like introduction and to get into it, I think, the right way. And maybe hopefully we'll get to spend a couple weeks in the book of Romans. But one thing to remember is that it's called the Epistle to the Romans. And that fancy word that we love using, all that means is letter. A letter to the Romans. Paul was writing a letter to congregations in Rome. And what we know from the Apostle Paul is all of his epistles, or all of his letters, they were letters to real people at real times going through real things. There is a situational reality to every letter that Paul was writing. People were asking questions. There were controversies going on. Things were happening, and Paul sat down to write about what was going on, things that were happening. And see, when we pay attention to some of the situational things going on in Paul's day, I think we can strip away maybe just a too oversimplistic reading of Romans, and we can see something a little bit more beautiful. And that might just be Paul's gospel, and that word gospel just meaning good news. And I say Paul's gospel for a reason. Because at this time, it's Paul's gospel. It's what Paul is going around and saying. And we see this at the very beginning of Romans. You get kind of right, if you've ever had to write like an academic paper or something, like in the introduction, you're supposed to formulate a thesis. And I've always struggled with my theses. Teachers always gave me a hard time because I wasn't good at this. Because as you can tell, I like to blabber and I like to go down rabbit holes. And a thesis is one sentence that describes the entire paper that you're going to write. And I'm like, well, I don't know. This just never works for me. I'm like, I'm going to say a lot of things. I don't know how to write one sentence. But Romans 1, 16 and 17 would probably be Paul's thesis for everything that's going to follow. Because we're starting in 16, because Paul usually began his letters with an introduction. Basically like, hey guys, how y'all doing? I hope you're blessed. And then he gets into it. And Paul says, for I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith. As it is written, always an allusion to the Old Testament, to their scriptures, the one who is righteous will live by faith. And so Paul is beginning and he's saying, I'm not ashamed of this gospel, and it is salvation for everyone, and the righteousness of God is revealed in this thing. Paul's gospel. Paul was a leading Pharisee in his day, a confident Pharisee, one who was zealous, one who was passionate about his faith, about his religious tradition. He was so passionate at one time when he heard of a bunch of Jewish blasphemers, these Jewish guys going around and saying this dead, naked, crucified guy on a cross was the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah. That infuriated Paul. It infuriated him so much that he was going to go around and do everything he could to see them put to death. Paul, a zealous Pharisee. However, as we know, in his mission to destroy these blasphemers, his life was interrupted. His life was interrupted by Jesus. Praise God when Jesus interrupts our lives, right? Another message for another day. He was interrupted by Jesus, and he met Jesus, and he began to learn who Jesus was. It talks about time. If you kind of pick up a timeline in Acts, Paul has time learning who Jesus is. And this began to shape and change everything. It began to modify and fill in the gaps for everything Paul thought he knew was being redone. He was seeing things and understanding things radically different. And guess what? He began to preach the gospel, the good news, Paul's gospel, and this created a lot of problems. Paul's new ideas, Paul meeting Jesus and Jesus helping, this began to change things, and he begins to preach this gospel of his, and it began to create a lot of problems in his peer group. See, Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. He's the Jewish Messiah, right? We all know that. Paul knew that. The Jews knew that. So ultimately, the Jewish Messiah is for the Jews, and there's still kind of, like others are still working this out. Some have begun to see Jesus as the Messiah, but he's the Jewish Messiah, which kind of still means you need to be Jewish. Like he's the Messiah for the Jews. And so even though there are those beginning to see Jesus, and they're beginning to put, like early on, it's just a Jewish movement. Early on, as Jesus resurrects and he ascends and people begin to gather around him, it's just a Jewish movement. There's no Gentiles. This comes later. And so he's the Jewish Messiah. You need to be Jewish. This means there is a way of life. There is something associated with what it means to be Jewish. And I would say primarily this Jewish way of life is best understood with men. And it's very simple. It's called circumcision. This is the gateway, entryway. The circumcision and being Jewish go like hand in hand. Circumcision is what was given to Abraham. It is the entryway. It is the beginning way of like entering the Jewish way of life. And you have to be Jewish because Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. But Paul is going around, and he's not just preaching. He's not preaching that Jesus is this Jewish Messiah. And at the time, as Paul's going around, there's a competing missionary team going around. And a lot of times, in commentaries, you're going to hear things like the Judaizers, the false teachers, Paul's opponents. There's another group of people that are going around, and they're showing up to these congregations. Paul's the original missionary. Paul's the one that's going around, and he started going around to Gentiles. And he starts proclaiming his gospel in Gentile nations. And he's going around and visiting different places. Well, there is a competing team going around behind him to the places that he has been. And they're realizing, you have Peter's event with the Gentiles, they're saying, you know what? God is reaching out to the Gentiles. God is doing something new. But these Gentiles still need to become Jewish. And so there's a group of people going around behind Paul, and they're going into the congregations, and it's saying, yeah, Jesus is awesome, but Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, basically, and you need to become Jews. And all you men in here, I got something to tell you. Yeah? I wonder how popular they were. Okay. But see, there's almost not, this is what's so important about the situation and the context. There is nothing that is infuriating Paul more than this dynamic that's going around and happening. There are other things that happen. There are lots of things that Paul deals with. But this aspect right here is driving Paul mad, because what he says is, it is a false gospel. It is no gospel at all. This is not it. This is why in Galatians 1, he had already been in Galatia. He had already started a congregation. He was proclaiming the gospel there. Now he's somewhere else. And he's getting word. People are writing to him, hey, Paul, there's some people coming here and they're saying some of this stuff. And this is why Paul opens up in Galatians 1. And you have here in chapter 6 some strong language from Paul. He goes, I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you in grace, called you in the grace of Christ, and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another gospel, but there are some who are confusing you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should proclaim to you a gospel contrary to what was proclaimed to you already, let that one person be cursed. Paul is not happy with what's happening because the gospel is at stake here. Paul is going around and preaching a gospel, and some other people are going around preaching a different gospel. And at the end of Galatians 5, Paul gets even a little bit more. Like, Paul has an edge to them. Some people miss this. Like, Paul's pretty edgy at one point, you know. And the New King James Version, maybe some of you when you were kids, you grew up on this one. It really kind of softened it right here at the end of Galatians 5. Because Paul returns to these Judaizers, these false gospelers who are trying to tell people, you need to become Jewish. And he says, brethren, if I still preach circumcision, because remember, this goes hand in hand. Like, circumcision is basically secondhand speak for becoming a Jew. Brethren, if I'm still preaching circumcision, why do I still suffer the persecution from these other Jews? Then the offense of the cross has ceased. I could wish that those who trouble you, he's talking to the Galatians, those that are troubling you, that they would just cut themselves off. That's how the New King James did it. Because the New King James really didn't want to deal with what the Greek was saying. They're just like, we can't, like kids that read, they just literally kind of change what it says. But all modern translations are like, you know what, we just got to be honest. Because what Paul says is, at the end in verse 12, he says, and for those Judaizers, I wish they would go the whole way and emasculate themselves. This is what Paul's saying. Paul's being a little edgy. He's going, yeah, those that preach circumcision, they just cut the whole thing off. Paul's upset. He's irritated because somebody is messing with the gospel. This happens in Philippians, same thing. See, this is a repeated issue that's happening in Paul's day. He's going around with a gospel and a good news of who Jesus Christ is, and there's a group of people going around behind him saying, you need to become Jewish. And Paul is fed up. And he deals with it in Philippians. Finally, my brothers, rejoice in the Lord. To write the same things to you, it's not troublesome to me, but it's for your safeguard. Beware of the dogs, beware of the evil workers, beware of those who mutilate the flesh. And he's talking about those that are going around saying you need to be circumcision because you need to be a Jew. He's going around, he's starting these congregations, and people are messing with it and telling other things. And see, now we get to Romans. See, in Galatia and Philippi and some of these other places, Paul started these little congregations, but time is kind of passing. There's also, things are spreading out. There's also Christians that are rising up in Rome. But see, Paul hasn't got to Rome yet. See, in these other places, Paul was there. Paul had time to be there and spend maybe 6 months to a year in some cases. I think in Ephesus, 2 years. And so think of what goes on if you're with somebody for 2 years. There's lots of dialogue. There's lots of time to talk and ask questions. But see, Paul hasn't been to Rome. But Paul wants to get to Rome. It says this near the end of the letter. Paul is waiting to get to Rome. He sees Rome as a very important and strategic place. He even talks about it. He sees it as a hub in which he can get into the further known world, into Spain and everything. So Paul can't wait to get to Rome. He's been trying to get to Rome. But Paul also knows about the Judaizers. Paul also knows about these competing gospels that are going around. And so Paul can't wait to get there. Paul can't just wait until one day he shows up to fix it. He is going to write a letter to the Romans. And this is why the letter of Romans becomes the longest and the most detailed one, because he needs to lay out his gospel. He needs to begin to preempt some stuff that's going around. And this is why he begins right there in 16, that he's not ashamed of the gospel, because it's the power of salvation. And this is the setting for Romans. He needs to beat the Judaizers to the punch is one of the issues that's going on. But then there's another issue that's going on that is related to the Judaizers and related to the gospel. And he needs to emphasize this. Because in Rome at the time, there's a lot of dissension. There's a lot of trouble between Jew and Gentile. The Jews and the Gentiles are not getting along in Rome. And see, Paul still sees this as a gospel issue. See, at one point, all the Jews were kicked out of Rome. Not the Roman Empire, but Rome. They were all kicked out. One of the emperors, Claudius, just said, everybody get out of here. And so there's a period of time when all the Jews had to leave Rome. So guess what happened in the churches? The churches still existed, but they became entirely Gentile churches. There wasn't a lot of mixture. It was just pagans, now followers of Jesus. But then Claudius dies. Guess what? Jews get to come back into Rome. And so you have a lot of Jews and Gentiles. But there is a lot of dissension there. And again, if we look in Romans 14, near the end of the book of Romans, you see this. You see what's going on is Jew and Gentile relations are strained, and it's basically over the way of life, the outward way of life. And this is where Paul's talking about. So you're saying, like, where is it? The weak and the strong. Paul's classifying this as weak and strong. And in Romans, at the beginning of Romans 14, it says, welcome those who are weak in faith. And yes, there's been a lot of work done on this. This weak in faith term is usually being identified with the Jews, with their Jewish way of life. So they're coming in. It says, welcome those who are weak in the faith, but not for the purpose of quarreling over all of these opinions. Don't just get into arguments. Some believe in eating anything. There's no restrictions on food, right? While the weak eat only vegetables. Those who eat must not despise those who abstain. And those who abstain must not pass judgment on those who eat. You're eating pork? You filthy sinner. On those who eat, for God has welcomed them. Who are you to pass judgment on servants of another? It is before their own Lord that they stand or fall, and they will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make them stand. Some judge one day better than the other. Got to worship on Saturday, the Shabbat. While others judge all days to be alike. Let all be fully convinced in their minds. Those who observe the day, observe it in honor of the Lord. Paul's saying, look, if they want to go to synagogue on Sunday, let them. They're doing it for the Lord. Since they give thanks to God, while those who abstain in honor of the Lord and give thanks to God. We do not live to ourselves, and we do not die to ourselves. If we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So then, whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. For to this end Christ died and lived again. Paul is dealing with all of this stuff that's going on between Jewish and Gentile people, the converts. This isn't to the outside. This is to the church. This is saying get along. And this is why right before this section he goes on talking about the weak and the strong and what you should eat and what you shouldn't eat and what day you should do this and what day you shouldn't do this. Paul is saying right before this, he's like, owe no one anything except to love one another. For the one that loves another has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you've heard them. Don't commit adultery, don't murder, don't steal, don't covet. And any of the other commandments are summed up in this. Love your neighbor as yourself. These are all gospel issues. These are gospel issues, and what Paul is primarily dealing is with the gospel and the gospel issues surrounding some of the controversy between Jewish and Gentile. And what does it mean? Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. What does this mean for Jews? What does this mean for Gentiles moving forward? And it's a gospel issue. And we know that Paul, again, he's going all that, and in the very last chapter, he returns as he's closing, as he begins and as he closes the letter of Romans. He's talking, he goes, brothers, I urge you, brothers and sisters, keep an eye on those that are causing the dissensions, in opposition to the teaching that you have learned. Avoid them. For such people are not serving the Lord Christ, but their own appetites. By smooth talk and flattery, they're deceiving the hearts of the simple-minded. See, we read some of these things and we overlook it and we think like, oh, like there's all of, I don't know what some people fill in the blank, but this is gospel issues, and this is about what is the gospel and what does it mean. And so real quick, as we're really just doing kind of an intro into the book of Romans, or we would be here for 2 hours, I want to go to Romans 1 through 3 and just give you a few thoughts as maybe you go home and read this today, or maybe you read Romans throughout the week and next week. Paul begins where he's talking about the gospel, and then he launches into a very clever rest of chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3. Paul is doing something very strategically. And I'll tell you what he's doing, in my best opinion. That ultimately Paul is collapsing the false gospel. He is collapsing the argument. He's basically telling Rome, hey, if you hear some people come in and they're talking in a certain way, your ears should pipe up and you should be like, you know what? No. That's not right. He's collapsing an argument because ultimately what he's doing in chapters 1 through 3, he shows, if you follow the argument, that at the end of the day, according to a particular gospel, that there are righteous Jews, those of circumcised, but there's also those that are circumcised that are in the Jewish way of life that are unrighteous Jews. But also, according to the logic of more of a works-based salvation, there's righteous pagans and there's unrighteous pagans. So there's both we'll use our modern day vernacular. There's saved Jews and unsaved Jews, and there's saved pagans and unsaved pagans. And that's what he's doing as he's kind of concluding in Romans 2:25. Circumcision is indeed of value if you obey the law, if you're saying it's about the law. But if you are circumcised and you're breaking the law, your circumcised has become uncircumcision. So if those who are uncircumcised, this is why Romans is so tricky, because you gotta kind of slow down. So if those who are uncircumcised, the pagans, the Gentiles, keep the requirements of the law, because it talks about a couple chapters, the law written on the heart. What about those that don't have the law, but they have the law written on their heart if they just do it? Those who are uncircumcised keep the requirements of the law. Will not their uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? Then those who are physically uncircumcised, pagans, Gentiles, but keep the law will condemn you, you Jew, who has the written code and are circumcised, but break the law. For a person who is not a Jew, who is one outwardly, nor is true circumcision something external and physical. Rather, a person is a Jew who is inwardly, and real circumcision is a matter of the heart. It is spiritual and not literal. It's a mouthful, I promise you, it really is. But what Paul is doing is he's collapsing the argument. If the Judaizers are going around and saying, hey, he's a Jewish Messiah and you need to become a Jew, because by becoming a Jew, you become a person of God and you will be delivered and saved. But Paul is saying, if you're relying upon circumcision and the Jewish way of life, but we can show that there's already pagans and Gentiles that have this unwritten law and they're following it, but there are circumcised ones who know the law, but they're breaking it. This is what's going on, this back and forth. It is a little tricky to follow. Then he's saying, you going into a place saying you need to be circumcised and you need to follow the Jewish life, the Jewish way of life, there's no guarantee that it's actually doing anything. Because there's already people, there are Jews right now that are circumcised and know the law, and they're not doing it. And by your own logic, they're not real Jews and they're not saved. I hope you're tracking. It makes sense. It makes a lot of sense to me. So what he's, yeah, I know. This is why Romans is so difficult. So he's trying to undercut that being circumcised and following a Jewish way of life doesn't do it. It doesn't guarantee or achieve anything that the Judaizers are going around to these congregations and trying to tell them to do. And this is why, at the core, it's this false gospel. This is why Paul is so upset, because they are putting this faith, they are putting their proclamation in what it means to be a Jew. And what we'll see is Paul is trying to say that the gospel is all about Jesus Christ. The Jewish way of life, this Judaizer argument, has nothing to do with Jesus. And so, as Paul goes through chapters 1, 2, and 3, he gets to this part where he just starts quoting a lot of scripture in chapter 3, verse 9. Because the last problem is the Judaizers don't see themselves as sinners. They think the Jewish way of life ultimately, that they're not sinners. So then Paul lobs like 7 verses together where he says, there's no one that's righteous. There's no one that has understanding. There's no one that seeks God. All have turned aside. There's no one that shows kindness. Not even one. Their throats are open graves. The venom a viper is under their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. And the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear. And Paul moves into 19. Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced and the whole world may be held accountable to God. For no human being will be justified in his sight. And so Paul is saying that being a Jew is not what gets you saved by God. And for you, O Jewish one, that thinks, but you know what, but I'm not sinning, Paul is using all of the Old Testament references so that everyone may be silenced to say, at the end of the day, you're a sinner. And so he's lobbing everything together, and then where does Paul go? And my goal today was to be super clever, because right here he quotes Psalm 143, which is the psalm that I read today. And it's actually a pretty important psalm. But do y'all want to be here another 20 minutes? I don't think so. But I think I can pass it. He quotes from Psalm 143 that explains God's saving. Go read it. Talks about God's saving activity. That psalm I read in between worship. By your truthfulness, by your righteousness, by your mercy. And it talks about God's righteousness is God's saving activity in the world. That God will save. There's nothing that the psalmist is doing. The psalmist is empty, and it's because God is faithful and righteous. God will reach down and God will save. And he does it, that line that he quotes, because none will be justified. God's not doing, Psalm 143 is talking about, God is not doing anything because you're justified or righteous or because you're doing the law. God does it because it's out of his truthfulness, his righteousness, and his mercy, is where Paul goes to quote from Psalm 143. And all that to say, as I'm sure I've thoroughly confused you, and I said I would get myself into trouble at the very beginning. But if you just track ultimately with the fact that Paul is very irritated with the false gospel that is going around to all these congregations trying to get people to do things and to prescribe a Jewish way of life and deeds, Paul is saying that none of that is the case. And then he finishes right here in chapter 3, and he says, "But now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been disclosed. And it is attested by the law and the prophets that the righteousness of God through the faithfulness of Jesus Christ, the righteousness of God through the faithfulness of Jesus Christ for all who believe or for all who are faithful." And so the righteousness of God is the fact, Psalm 143 and everything he's saying is that it was God's initiative out of his mercy and his goodness to send his Son, the faithful Messiah, and that those who return in faithful will be saved. This is the gospel that Paul is laying out right here. Paul is laying out a gospel that is completely centered on God's initiative, God's goodness, and God's sending, and God's doing. It has nothing to do with some standard or requirement or being Jewish. It has nothing to do, there's no faith or confidence, circumcision, Jewish way of, there is no faith or confidence in anything other than God's initiative, his saving activity through Jesus Christ. And this is the center of what Paul is doing in Romans 3. And you have that famous verse in chapter 5 where I would say it like this. If I needed to put a banner on Romans, that Romans is answering the question about what is the righteousness of God. And Paul is answering, do you know what the righteousness of God is? It's the fact that he is acting in the world. He is acting in the world in a saving way through Jesus the Messiah, who died for everyone while they were enemies and unjust and living in their own ways. This is why he can then address, why are you guys not getting along? Why are you so worried about what you're eating and what he's not eating? Why can't you guys get together? God has acted in a way in the universe at this time in his Son Jesus Christ, because that was his prerogative of what he wanted to do by his goodness, his mercy, in his love, and he did it while all of you were apart from him. And I'm going to save the next part for next week. Because Paul moves in. We're really just Romans 1 through 3. Paul continues his argument, because here's the question you should ask. He's talking about the righteousness of God. And he's talking about that the righteousness of God is about God's saving activity in Jesus the Messiah. And because of Jesus' faithfulness for those that are faithful. And so I hope, like maybe the reader in Romans, your question is, so who are the faithful? His gospel is the saving activity of God in Jesus. And it's for those who believe. This is where translations, the same Greek word will be used 6 times, and your Bible's trying to help you out will interpret the same word like in 4 different English words. It really confuses us sometimes. But it's the same word as the faith of Christ is the faith that you're supposed to have. This faithfulness of Christ are for those that are faithful. And so that next question becomes, who are the faithful? And Paul picks this up in chapters 4 and moves through probably till about 8, 9, and then he touches back in on the Jewish people again. And so, as we're beginning to dive into Romans, I don't feel there's any way to do justice to Romans without like a little background and a little bit of intro. But I do hope over the next 2 weeks, if you keep those things in mind, what Paul is doing, I think you will begin to see this original gospel that Paul is going around establishing congregations all throughout the known world with his proclamation of a God of love who in his initiative, in his truthfulness, in his mercy, quoting Psalms 143, by his goodness, has made all of the activity and has moved in. And how does Paul also just know this? He's experienced it. Because he was thoroughly set in his ways. And by God's goodness and grace and love, caught Paul and interrupted his life by his own initiative. And that right there radically changed Paul's life. And that is where it's going to begin to pick up in Romans 4. How is somebody interrupted by Jesus and their life radically transformed? And Paul is not going to say it's by becoming a Jew and following the Jewish way of life. He's going to say something radically different. And you shouldn't mix next week. Let's pray. Lord, help us as we do dive into one of the most disputed and controversial books in the New Testament. Lord, there's a lot there. And I just pray that during the next few weeks, as we just look in this really wonderful letter, Lord, that you open our eyes, Lord, that you help us to see the beauty of Jesus Christ, to understand the gospel of grace and good news is a gospel of your choice, your character, and your initiative. Lord, it's a rescue mission. All of life, this gospel is a rescue mission of your children being hijacked, Lord, and you coming in because of your love. You are a deliverer. And open our eyes to Jesus Christ in this season. Amen.